Welcome to the podcast, Hannah.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm very excited to have you on. We're going to be talking about a lot of really cool topics. But before we get started, I always like to start out with kind of like an origin story and learn how you got into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I am a registered dietitian. I've been mainly practicing medical nutrition therapy for the last 10 years in a more clinical setting. And, and then I became a mom. I have two young daughters. One's almost 8. You got to say almost 8. and
Yeah.
the other one's 9. So they're really young. And I, working at the hospital part-time, and I started noticing my own symptoms of things that just felt like off. And simultaneously, I was also becoming more interested in learning about more integrative functional nutrition.
Mhm.
And so that really led me down. It started off as a way for me to kind of figure out what was going on with me, because of course, like so many of the clients I work with now, you go to the doctors, you ask for some labs to be done, and they just say, oh, you're absolutely fine. You might
Yep.
just be stressed. You're stressed out. You're a young mom. Of course, it's normal to feel exhausted all of the time and stuff like that. So I just was like really interested in doing more digging. And so I got some training in advanced lab testing and more like integrative functional nutrition. And so from there, I was able to figure out what was going on with me. And I actually have an autoimmune condition. It's called Hashimoto.
Mhm.
And so that really affects, your energy levels, your gut health, your immune system obviously is involved. So it was so incredibly validating, and it really excited me. I was like, I feel if I can figure out a way to use advanced lab testing and combine that with my more clinical expertise, and combine that together to really like help women feel empowered about how to support their health and how they feel, and they're showing up in their lives every day. And so it just really really excited me. So that's kind of what got me started with that. And then I pivoted towards that about 3 years ago. Started my own virtual practice, working more in like the women's health space. So like hormones, gut health, autoimmune conditions. And then as I was doing more of that work, I was like, okay, I'm seeing a common theme here. These women, their root cause a lot of the time is nervous system
Mhm.
dysregulation.
Yeah.
And I got really tired of just saying over and over again, you need to manage your stress a little bit better.
Mhm.
I wanted to be able to give them so much more than that. And obviously, I knew that from my own journey. I really had to integrate that. And so, but I wanted to like figure out how to help my clients integrate that. So then I became a certified meditation teacher and spent a year studying spiritual psychology, which is like a blend of Eastern ritual and practices with Western psychology.
Well,
Now,
that's so cool.
yeah. So now I really like to supplement my programs with giving my clients tools on how to regulate their nervous systems as well. And so it's more of like life coaching almost.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll integrate some things like meditation or breath work together. It really just depends on how the client wants to be supported. So that's that
Awesome.
in a nutshell. Yeah.
It's interesting because I actually
Yep.
did an episode on nervous system, really the vagal tone, and how
Yes.
there's a link with a weaker vagal tone and things like endometriosis or PCOS. And I thought that was just fascinating. So, yeah, I'd love to really kind of dig deep on all of these things. So, just for people listening and they're kind of like hearing nervous system for the first time, because, well, maybe they've listened to my podcast, maybe not when I talked about the nervous system, but what should people like explain the nervous system, explain how the nervous system ties into certain conditions?
I mean, that's a very, like, that's pretty broad because it's
So,
like,
like, just
really
like
depends on.
how does the nervous system like tie into certain conditions?
I don't know what condition it doesn't, honestly.
Yeah.
The more I get like deep in the weeds with this. So, a lot of my clients, so I'm typically working with people with autoimmune conditions and hormone imbalances, gut health, that kind of stuff. And I would say the nervous system impacts all of those areas.
Yeah.
Because ideally, especially when we're talking about women's health and like hormones, things like that, we really just want to create safety in the body,
Yeah.
right? So that we can manufacture hormones
Hmm.
and ovulate naturally and things like that. So, and then, inflammation's another piece of that. It really just it's a great way to, like, it just connects to everything, right?
Yeah. Well, the vagus nerve is incredibly important when it comes to gut health. And the stronger the vagal tone, the better the vagus nerve, the better it's able to lower inflammation in the body. And I find that
Mhm,
like so
mhm.
fascinating and interesting. And so, what are some of the things that you do suggest for people when they want to regulate their nervous system and support that aspect?
So, first of all, I think it's important to just figure out what are the systems for that client, what are the systems that are working for them and what's not, and really get really honest about that. And then, it could be something like starting a very doable meditation practice or some breath work, like before meals, right? Getting into rest and digest, me activating that vagus nerve so that we can digest our food properly. So it really just depends on what is feels a lot most aligned for the client and is doable for them. But also, I think another big piece of this, which is not really talked about often, is eating for blood sugar balance, because even like blood sugar swings throughout the day can cause fluctuations in your mood and your
Yeah,
anxiety and cravings and all of, and even inflammation as well. So
that
it's
is
like a
such a
whole
good
body
point.
approach.
Oh, 100%. It's such a good point. And I remember like looking into this and researching like just really the gut brain connection. And it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting because you can see it really go both ways. So if you have imbalanced gut microbiome, that can impact your brain and your mood and your state and your emotions. And it actually is linked with certain emotional imbalances or like mental disorders. It's really fascinating. And then they found on the flip side that people who meditated for many years, like Tibetan monks, they had a really vast microbiome that was a lot more
Mm-hmm.
enriched and had a lot more diversity. So it's really fascinating how you really can literally get it at both ends or either end.
Yeah. Like I tell my clients all the time, if you're breathing into your shoulders, the majority of the
Hmm.
time, that's going to signal to the brain that you're in fight or flight. So it's going to send all the blood to your extremities. It's not going to be sending the blood to, you know, your GI tract and
Right,
your organs there. And so it's going to be a lot harder to digest your foods. Whereas if you are really
right.
taking these deep breaths into your belly, it's sending all the blood there. And that's a and I mean, I often get skipped.
Hmm.
People are
That's
just like, no,
actually a really good
just give me a
point.
meal plan. I want to feel better. I want to lose
That's
weight, or I want
true.
to, but it's like you really got to think about not just what you're eating, but how you're eating, like what your nervous
Yes.
system state is, when you're eating food.
That's so true. It's actually
Hmm.
really, really true. And it was funny because I was reading about that, and it was one of the things to do is just never stand. Like, this is why they say, like, don't drive and eat at the same time, because when you're driving naturally, you're going to be in a little bit more of a fight or flight or kind of ready for anything. And also, just to kind of throw it out there, it's not bad to be in that state, in that sympathetic state. It's part of life. It's just that sometimes you need that, and then sometimes you need the other. But what you're saying is so true. Like, it's actually like becoming mindful of getting yourself into that state and maybe doing those exercises to get yourself in a more parasympathetic state, which is more of the rest and digest, so that you're priming your body when you do eat to digest better. So I think that that's
Yeah,
an awesome
of
point.
course. And, if you're digesting better, you're absorbing nutrients better, which is going
Right.
to impact your energy levels, your mood, your hormones, everything. So, yeah, I feel like the more I get into it, the more I see that there really isn't an aspect of our health, our metabolic health, everything that is not touched by your nervous system.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. Like the more I dig into this, the more I'm just like so amazed at how really, it's the nervous system is kind of like this wiring of like information. It's almost like information that kind of signals to your body all kinds of different states, but especially that safety. I agree with you. When you feel safe, you can be more creative. And what does that mean really in the body? Fertility, and it also
Yeah.
regeneration, growth. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I mean, hormones, that's how hormones work too. They're just chemical messengers in your body.
Right. And so talk about PCOS, because I know that you work with PCOS
Yeah.
a lot, just to cover, because I think a lot of people don't really understand it fully, because it is, there's so many different types of PCOS
Mhm.
and people get confused. And sometimes people show PCOS symptoms, but then some doctors, and we don't know if they're just not like looking thoroughly into it, dismiss it. Oh, that's not PCOS. So let's kind of
Right.
talk about that and just kind of nation of
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll just start. What is PCOS? So PCOS stands for polycystic ovarian syndrome. So a lot of people get confused by that right off the bat. They think, oh, so does that mean I have cysts on my ovaries?
Right.
Does that mean that I have it? So it's actually not a physical ovarian condition, like of the presence of cysts, but it's rather a hormonal condition. And it's what I like to call a spectrum condition, because there's different varieties and there's different root causes.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to understand, first of all, what kind of PCOS you have and what the root causes are, which is why we use functional lab testing in practice. But yeah, I think a lot of women, often it's like a long, confusing road full of mixed messages of like just lose weight advice.
Yeah. But sometimes
you
you get
know?
really, really thin PCOS patients. So that's where it can get so confusing for people.
Right. 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 And so a PCOS isn't an ovarian condition. What exactly is going on? I
Right.
mean, in a nutshell, it's basically blood sugar issues plus inflammation
Mm-hmm.
plus genetic susceptibility, which is going to lead to the ovaries to begin to produce large amounts of androgens. So, and I say genetic susceptibility because, just because you have like insulin resistance or diabetes, that doesn't mean you automatically are going to get PCOS. Some people just have really sensitive ovaries, right? And so they're going to develop the condition. So I like to talk to my clients about, well, first of all, we start by running some tests to find out, what their root causes are. And then we're going to really go deep with, working on the blood sugar issues, with the inflammation, real food strategies, lifestyle interventions, things like that.
One of the things that I find is pretty common just in my own practice is that there's a huge link of gut imbalance or, gut microbiome imbalance and inflammation, that is part of the contributor to the inflammation and can really impact PCOS conditions.
Yeah, because if that inflammation in the gut is going unchecked, that's also going to drive that insulin resistance even more.
Yeah. What are some of the tests that you do for PCOS? Functional tests.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, I like to start with a Dutch test. It's have you heard of Dutch?
Yep. I run it
Yeah.
myself. Yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I would run a Dutch, so that
Which is
we,
dried out, just for people listening
yeah.
and
Yes.
have never heard of it before. So it's dried urine testing for I forget the
It's
exact comprehensive hormone.
dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. I know I used to think, oh, it's of Dutch, like it's from the Dutch, like,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
just an abbreviation.
Right.
But yes, it's a very unique way to look at hormones because traditionally, before this test was available, you would have to rely on blood work for hormones and, saliva for cortisol, which was okay, but it's just not great. So this test really helps us get a lot more specific, a lot more personalized, and helps us get some answers that would probably be left unanswered if we were just, looking at blood work alone. So, it's going to tell us, give us a snapshot of all three sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. It's going to show us how they're being metabolized in the liver. And then what I really like is it looks at your cortisol awakening response. So if someone is struggling with sleep, mood, energy levels, things like that, that could also be driving your symptoms and your inflammation as well.
Right.
So
Actually, where cortisol is your friend in the morning.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. And then I like that it also has that organic acid test at the end there, which some of those other markers are going to be important for looking at for hormone production. So it's nice that they include that. So I like to do a Dutch. I also like to do HTMA testing, which stands for hair tissue mineral analysis, because, when we're looking at hormones, it's, we also want to be thinking about minerals too, because, and not just like our minerals through blood work, but more on a cellular level. Like, what is the body doing with those minerals, and how is your body utilizing them? Are they even getting up into the cell? So, and we can, minerals, they impact hormones, which means they're going to impact PCOS.
Yeah.
So I like that one too. And it's like it's a nice way to, I like it because it shows your body's, like, it's like a blueprint. It shows you your stress pattern, how your body is using minerals after you've maybe gone through a season of, really high stress. And, the fertility journey too is so stressful on its
for
own.
sure. 100%.
That I'm like, yeah, let's look at what your body does with all this stress and how we can really, like, deeply nourish your body and, make it feel safe for ovulation.
Yeah. I know that there's a lot of minerals that you can't really test in blood. And for example, magnesium, that's a really hard one to test for. So does this test for magnesium as well, like all minerals?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It looks at all of the minerals, specifically the ones that I'm going to be focusing on. The minerals that impact PCOS would be magnesium, zinc, calcium, iron, selenium, iodine. So, and in a nutshell, these minerals, they can exacerbate insulin resistance, hormonal imbalances, oxidative stress, which is important for like egg quality, sperm quality, things like that. So women, get your men to your partner.
Yes. So this is a hair test?
Yeah, it's a hair. They're using just like a teaspoon amount of your hair to analyze the mineral content in your tissues.
Fascinating. I know they've done those for like heavy metals and just testing the toxins, but I didn't know, I haven't heard of the mineral testing yet.
Yeah. And this test does include heavy metals.
Oh, it does. Minerals and heavy metals. Okay, cool. Sometimes it's really high just like for people that don't have symptoms. Sometimes I almost feel like it's like high for everybody.
The heavy metals?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard to find somebody who doesn't have like
yeah. And I mean, we're exposed to heavy metals all of the time. It's it's kind of impossible to get around it. It's in our food, our water, the soil, and so my approach is, we might see like an acute exposure to the heavy metals, but what we want to see is that you're able to detox and excrete those heavy metals safely. That's why, we have our detox organs, our liver, right?
Yep.
And so if I ever see those metals like pushing into the tissues, it's just a really good indication that, hey, your liver needs some attention. Like, we need to work on supporting that and also working on not just our detoxification organs, but our drainage pathways. So like our lymphatic system, making sure we're having daily bowel movements, that we're sweating, all of that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that's key, is really detoxifying, and I think that you had a good point. You mentioned the word safely, because that can be an issue. Like if you detoxify too harshly, I'm really big on that, especially when you're trying to conceive and you're actively trying. You definitely don't want to do something that's so strong that it actually circulates more toxins in your bloodstream.
That's right. Yeah.
So they have like binders, right? Or things that will
Yeah,
bind.
that is one approach. For me, I rarely will do like a heavy metal detox with somebody. I will just want to work with them on, first the foundational things of, are we optimizing the gut health,
Mhm.
the liver function? Are we getting those drainage pathways open? Because your body should be able to do all that on its own if it's,
Right.
optimal. But I mean, if someone's already doing like a gut protocol or something with me, then yeah, they'll be taking like those types of supplements, and then it'll still act on the heavy metals and things like that as well.
Yeah. Interesting. So, what are some of the nutrient and lifestyle interventions specifically that you would do for PCOS? Or have you seen? Because
So
I do know that there's
yeah,
many different types, so that could change
yes,
depending on the type. But just in
yes,
general, for what are
yeah.
some of the things that people should kind of like look out for, or think about?
Yeah, yeah. So the first step is going to be improving the quality of your food choices.
Mhm.
So, removing inflammatory oils, added sugars, a lot of like processed, like ultra processed carbohydrates and, with chemical and artificial additives, things like that. You want to replace them with whole, real foods. It's really that simple.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, yeah. And then also, the goal is to eat a sufficient amount of carbohydrates to promote ovulation, but while still focusing on those whole, real, like food sources, like starchy veggies, fruits, and then unprocessed whole grains and legumes.
So, really, from natural sources, complex carbs. So it's not like simple carbs, not white, avoid those like.
Yeah, right. So you would want to make sure you're getting adequate amount of carbohydrates, but if we're also dealing with insulin resistance, then we
Mhm.
also need to be talking about, maintaining adequate calorie intake and just aiming for balance across all the macronutrients. So, we're pairing those carbohydrates with good quality sources of protein and healthy fats. And if you're eating a more whole food carbs diet, like, your carbs are coming from fruits and like root vegetables and things like that, then those foods are naturally going to have more fiber in them, which is also going to help with things like insulin resistance. And then I would also be focusing on gut nourishing foods like bone broth, probiotics from
Yeah.
fermented foods, cultured products, and then lots of prebiotic fibers. So it also just making sure you're eating a wide range of plant fibers. Like we're not just eating the same spinach every day. Let's
Yeah.
really mix that up. Maybe like arugula, kale, So that would be where I would start with food strategies. And then for lifestyle, I would be really focusing on exercise. This is a really crucial tool in repairing insulin sensitivity and managing blood sugar levels. So, first, I would just focus on increasing your daily movement. So, maybe try tracking your steps. And then maybe you would want to consider adding in some resistance training and some short hit style workouts, since those really show the most metabolic improvements. In general, I would avoid like really long duration cardio on a regular basis, since that's like very stressful on the body. So exercise is number one. Stress management is key. I know we've already kind
Yeah.
of touched on that a little bit. That's a big piece of hormonal balance, since your adrenal health, has the ability to impact the function of your sex hormones. I would just evaluate the sources of your stress. I like to think of it like a bucket, like a stress bucket, and we have all these different inputs pouring in. Some of
Yeah.
those things we can't really remove, but
Right.
some things we can. You can
Yeah.
control your nutrition and your sleep quality.
Right.
You can maybe work on energetic boundaries, right? Or maybe you want to include things like meditation or journaling, acupuncture, right? Those are all really nice ways to support yourself. And then sleep. Sleep is also like so major. That's when when you get good quality sleep at night, that's when your body's repairing tissue, and it has a lot to do with your hormones, like your hunger hormones, those ones. And then also like cortisol, melatonin, things like that, everything that just keeps all of the systems working together smoothly. So, yeah.
I know
Do
a
you
lack of sleep, there's like a lot of times will increase sugar cravings because you want that quick energy. So
Yes.
that's one example of how that can impact it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. If you have like one poor night of sleep, it increases your hunger hormone
Mhm.
levels pretty
Yeah.
significantly.
Yeah.
So we'll see that issue popping up time and time again. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and I also have heard in some cases I've seen kind of like a link with a lot of PCOS patients having also Hashimoto's. There's,
mhm,
there have, I mean, not in every case, but it does happen quite a bit. And have you so what are some of the things actually, just to kind of like go literally pivot into autoimmune and how you can address that in the case of Hashimoto's, because it is so prevalent and a lot of people have it. The first thing that I say is cut out gluten, corn, and dairy and soy if you can. Now, I always say if you can't do all of them, at least cut out the gluten entirely. And talk to us about like what you've done and what you found to be helpful, because it is something that if you catch early, you really
mhm.
can shift a lot just from diet alone.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've helped hundreds of women with that. Exactly. Just, I've seen different stages of Hashimoto's,
Yeah.
So if it's like, stage one, where we're seeing the presence of antibodies and maybe they have symptoms, maybe they don't.
Hmm.
A lot of those women typically will present with like subclinical hypothyroidism. So like their thyroid labs look fine, but they're like, I feel tired all the time. I'm constipated. I can't lose weight. So the first thing I would start with is kind of getting ahead of things because the majority of your immune system is in your gut. So
Right.
I would be doing I would run a stool sample, a GI map, and see what's going on there, because there's different things that could be driving that immune response. Yeah, it could be coming from things in the diet like gluten, and that test certainly will show us if you're having an immune response to gluten. So in those cases, I would have those clients cut that out. And some people they don't run the test and they cut out gluten, but they just feel better without it.
Yeah, I see that a lot. And I don't
I
know if
do
it's the
too, just kind of
glyphosate. I
anecdotally.
don't know what it is.
I was just
Yeah.
gonna say that I think
Yeah.
it is because of like what they're spraying on our crops.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
We know that it can impact hormones like big time. So that's a huge
Hmm.
one for sure.
Yeah. So, and then, obviously if there's uh inflammation or like leaky gut, we're going to want to address that anyway, because that could be driving that immune response and making your symptoms worse, making the antibodies levels worse, right? So really want to just get ahead of it with the gut, number one. And then I like to do mineral testing as well, since so many minerals not only impact PCOS, but they
Right.
impact your thyroid.
Selenium, that's a huge one. Yeah.
Yes, selenium. This is a
Iodine.
common thing that I see. I'll see really high amounts of calcium in the tissues, and that's going to block your thyroid hormone from getting up into the cell. So, like
Oh,
maybe their
interesting.
thyroid panel looks great, but or they're already taking a thyroid medication, but they feel like it's not doing anything for them. I'm like, look, you have a lot of calcium in your tissues. And so, like, that's your thyroid hormone not even getting up into the cell. So,
Hmm.
of course, you wouldn't feel an impact there. And that
What
also
causes
is going
that
to,
actually? What causes that calcification?
so I typically see that from over supplementing with vitamin D.
Mhm.
So that will pull the calcium out of the
Oh, that's
bone and
interesting.
teeth and put it into the tissues. Yeah. A lot of people get put on vitamin D by their doctor, like maybe they had low levels at one point, and then their doctor never talked to them about weaning off of the vitamin D. They
Yeah.
just kept
Yeah.
taking
It
it.
gets too high. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Or they'll start them off like a really high dose. Like I've seen like 50,000 units
Oh,
of
wow. Yeah. Now
vitamin.
that's
Yeah.
high.
And they just keep taking it. Like then they're
Hmm.
never told like, hey, you're actually supposed to taper off of that after a couple months. I've also seen an influx of people on vitamin D, zinc, ever since the pandemic.
Mhm.
So they
Right.
just kept taking it
Yeah.
and they don't know how that's impacted their mineral levels. So yeah, that's one culprit I'll see. And the other thing that I notice, and this is pretty prevalent in the autoimmune community, is, and I don't think it's talked about a lot, is significant trauma and certain types of trauma. It's like when we see this pattern on an HTMA test, we call it a calcium shell, where the calcium and the magnesium levels are really high in the tissues, and then we are like really depleted in things like potassium and sodium and other secondary minerals. And it's kind of like the body's way of shielding itself
Oh,
from
that's so interesting.
feeling really big emotions. So like a lot of these clients, I'll talk to them about this and they have such a flat effect, like and then we start moving the calcium out of the tissues, and then it's like they really need more emotional support
Oh,
throughout that
wow.
process. It's
That's
very
really
interesting.
interesting.
I'm about
That's
to
wild.
actually do an HTMA on myself. It's been a couple of years, but I'm grieving my mom right now. And
To hear that.
and it's just been a really rough couple of months. And I've just been going through the motions and kind
Yeah.
of in that, like, taking care of her, taking care of my girls, like just everything that we've gone through leading up to this point. And I'm like, I am so curious to know what's going on with my minerals right now.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if I was having calcium going into my tissues, because I believe that's what was my pattern last time I ran the test a few years ago. So
Oh, that's interesting.
it's like, yeah, this is my unique pattern,
Yeah.
So I see that a lot with Hashimoto's.
That's
And
really fascinating.
yeah, and it's interesting because that pattern, like the high calcium in the tissues and the low potassium, that's really really common with like thyroid stuff in general, because first of all, that calcium's blocking the thyroid hormone from getting up into the cell. It's also going to be blocking insulin signaling, so there's going to be a lot of blood sugar swings, and that's going to be
Right.
driving the inflammation, making that worse. And then the low potassium, well, potassium is needed for thyroid function as well. So I see that pattern a lot with that population, and it's
Oh,
so
wow.
fascinating. And I would just say, like, I wouldn't say it's like, it's more like anecdotal, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you probably see that too in your
Yes,
practice.
a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
For different things, not this specifically, but yeah, I mean, you see a lot of that, and that matters just because studies are very expensive to have, and you can't like kind of rely just on studies. You have to really rely on data in general, like your own experience.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
there's so much information that you can get just from that. And then a couple of things. One of the things is I know that wobenzyme has been shown to really help. It's an enzyme. It's proteolytic enzymes that break apart like fibrous tissue. So I'm curious to know
Oh,
if it would help with excess calcium or, deposits, because it works to break down things that
yeah.
aren't really needed in the body. I'd be
Yeah.
curious to look
Yeah.
that up.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
because when we see, usually the calcium in the tissues is also associated with things like restless leg syndrome, kidney
Oh,
stones,
interesting.
gallstones, all that stuff, because
Oh,
it's just
wow.
calcification of the tissues,
Yeah.
right? What I do is if that person has actually been on vitamin D, what I'll do is I'll say, okay, let's just pause on the vitamin D, and then I'll get them on a form of vitamin K2 that will target that calcium in the tissues and redirect it back to the bones. So we'll do that for several months. And if that person's still concerned about their vitamin D levels, I say, let's just get that checked.
Yeah.
And depending on where you're at with that, you either, probably need supplementation from time to time, or maybe just during the winter, right? But it's not a long-term, supplement for you because
Right.
of this pattern that you typically have.
Another thing that I was going to mention is we were talking about like antibodies. I remember one of my patients mentioning she had because I was talking to an REI and I was going to I had him on the podcast. And so she had some questions and she had a very low amount of antibodies that are considered normal. And he said no, because the presence of any antibody, and that's what's crazy to me. then why is it
Mhm.
considered normal in labs if it's
Yeah, well,
not? It shouldn't
yeah.
be there.
Yeah, the reference ranges for conventional labs or like in more like conventional healthcare settings, they're designed to show like if you have a chronic disease or not, not necessarily if
Right.
you're optimal, right? Like
Yes. Right.
thriving,
Right. Because
you
if
know?
you have any, even if it's like minute, it means that there's an autoimmune, like
Right.
something
And
attacking your thyroid.
yeah, and I mean, my first thought is like, and just because I've worked in that arena for so long is,
Yeah.
I think it's just because they need to have a diagnosis for a chronic disease, number one, so that they can bill the insurance and blah blah blah.
Yeah. 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 No.
So they typically
It's like a
can't treat
system.
you. They technically can't treat you like they don't really run on a. It's more of like a sick care model. It's not really. They can't really treat you for like prevention,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
That's not how insurance companies work. So
Hmm.
I think that's my theory on that. But
Hmm.
but to answer your question, yes, I see low levels that aren't considered
Right.
Hashimoto's, but I would label that early stages or stage one. And I would
Yep.
say let's order GI map.
Hmm.
Let's look at what your minerals are doing, like that impact your thyroid. Let's just start helping you feel better right away so that we can go into remission. I
Yeah.
would much rather my client like just go ahead and work on those things instead of waiting until it's like, now we're seeing tissue damage,
Yes.
and there's a
Yeah.
lot of practices.
Because you can
I don't,
reverse it if it's early enough. But if it's
yeah,
really, really like far gone, it can cause a lot of
yeah,
damage.
it can. And I don't know if you've run across this a lot in your practice or with your clients, but I've been told a lot of times that they weren't even able to request or see a specialist or an endocrinologist, I guess, until they were able to see tissue damage. And it's like, wouldn't you want to just prevent
Oh my
the tissue
gosh.
damage?
It's crazy to me. Yeah.
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 So I just like to get on it like right away, even if
Yeah.
it's like, your antibodies are like 5,
Yeah. 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 Really low, but still,
Yeah,
that
really
shouldn't be there
low.
in the first place.
Yeah, it's worth working on.
And I
Yeah.
had actually just recently, I had a case where her TSH was like 5 and she's young, she's in her 20s. And I'm like, okay, that's
Mhm.
not normal. But they say, oh, it's
Mhm.
just a little abnormal, but that's not a little abnormal for somebody trying to conceive because you want it
Yeah.
2 and under. So if you go, here's the thing, if you go to a general doctor or even an OB, they are a little more general in women's health.
Yeah.
So they're not going to look at it the same way as an REI is going to look at it, which is a reproductive endocrinologist, and they're going to look
Right.
at it completely different perspective. Yeah, so those things I think a lot of people just don't realize, and they're going in and they get the wrong information or they don't get like the full information, and many years go by, and it's kind of like that's why it's so important to really get ahead of it.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think you're worthy of feeling better, if
Yeah,
does it have to be something that's chronic or
right,
like full
exactly.
on disease state before just feeling better.
Yeah, for sure. So, for people who, are curious and want to learn more about what you do, what are some of the things you offer online? Where can people find you?
So for people who are wanting to work one-on-one with me or maybe just start off with a consultation or have some labs done, you can find me at through Pivot Nutrition Coaching. So the website is pivotnutritioncoaching.com. And then if for my social media, I'm on Instagram at rooted with Hannah.
Awesome. I'll have all the
Yep.
notes anyway. If anybody is curious or wants to know exactly how it's written out or find the link, you can find those
Yeah.
on the episode notes. So Hannah, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a great conversation. I love really digging deep on just what goes on with these conditions that so many people hear about that are trying to conceive, but they don't really understand it. And I think there's so much power in knowledge and understanding and kind of like going beneath the surface. So I think this is one of the things that I like to do on the show is really to educate people on really what's going on. So you've really shared some great, valuable information. So thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you so much for having me. And I think that this is such an important conversation to have. And a valuable platform. So it's really an honor to be here, and hope we can chat again soon.
Thank you.